New fic here. It's a one-shot called 17 Going on 17 by Nocturnal Anomaly. It is teen and up audience, no archive warnings, fandom, Batman all media types, relationships, Bat family members and Tim Drake and Duke Thomas, Tim Drake, Jason Todd, Tim Drake and Dick Grayson, Stephanie Brown and Tim Drake, Cassandra Cain and Tim Drake and Damian Wayne. Digital tags for Tim Drake-centric, Vampire Tim Drake, Crack, Fluff, Bat Family Shenanigans, Tim Drake's birthday, light misunderstandings, Twilight series references, humor, Tim Drake being a little shit, Tim Drake is permanently 17, Duke Thomas being a little shit, domestic Bat Family, domestic Fluff, sibling bonding, Tim Drake is a menace. Summary. Jason frowned. You were also 17 the year before that. Tim glanced at him. Was I? Yes. Oh. Tim considers that. Then yeah. Damian mutters suspiciously. You were also 17 when you met me, Drake. Tim? Dick asks apprehensively. How long have you been 17? An amused flicker passed over Tim's face. A while. Or, it's Tim's 17th birthday. Again. Notes. In honor of Tim Drake turning 17 yesterday for the 1000th time. It all started with a mysterious package. Damien was the one to find it. It had been delivered with the morning post, an unremarkable, inconspicuous little thing. A small brown box. Unremarkable, but for the postage label taped atop it. Mixed in several envelopes addressed to Duke and a catalog Alfred had repeatedly attempted and failed to unsubscribe from. The address had been written in blue ink. Wayne Manor, Gotham, New Jersey. There was no name. Damien frowned. Pennyworth, he called, lifting the package carefully from the pile. Who is this intended for? Alfred looks up from where he was arranging breakfast on the table. I'm afraid the sender neglected to specify, Master Damien. Then why was it accepted? Because it was addressed to the house. That is an unacceptable security practice. I shall be certain to reprimand the postman. Damien ignored the dry note in his voice as he turned the package over. There were no return address either, just a sticker bearing the words, Keep out of direct sunlight, accompanied by a crudely drawn, frowning sun. The door creaked open and Dick appeared in the doorway, face turned over his shoulder as he talked with Jason, who was a step behind. They both looked tired, dressed in sweats from their hair used from sleep. Damien looked up. Is this yours? Dick paused, one hand still resting on the door. He looked away from Jason to the package in Damien's hand. Nope, not mine. He broke off into a yawn, lifting one hand to cover his mouth. Jason peered over his shoulder. What is it? If I knew, I would not be asking, Damien retorted. Could be a bomb, Jason suggested. Dick grimaced and shoved his shoulder. Why would you say that? Because the kid's holding it like it's a bomb. Damien looked down at the package. He was holding it perfectly ordinarily, with both hands positioned carefully beneath it, and his arms extended far enough that should it unexpectedly detonate, the blast would be directed away from his vital organs. I am exercising an appropriate degree of caution. At which point, Duke wandered into the room, squeezing his way behind Dick and Jason, who were still blocking the doorway. Whoa, hey, good morning, just coming through. He was still in his pajamas, but he shrugged a Gotham Giants hoodie over them. He also looked far more awake than they did. Jason grumbled as Duke shoved a hand in his face as he passed. Hey, watch it, kid. Oh, sorry, Duke said, not sounding sorry at all. Didn't see you there behind all the doorway you were blocking. Jason narrowed his eyes at him. Duke smirked and then glanced at Dick. Morning, Dick. Sleep well? Well enough, Dick muttered, with a half-muffled yawn. Patrol ran late. Rough, Duke said sympathetically. Oh, so he gets that, but I get a hand to my face as my greeting? Jason demanded immediately. Duke raised an eyebrow at him. Would you like me to ask how you slept? Jason folded his arms. It would be polite. All right, Duke gave him a quick once-over. Badly, apparently. Jason let out an offended noise. Dick snored loudly, moving further into the room. He clapped a hand on Duke's shoulder as he passed. Oh, you got him good. Duke's grin widened, and he followed Dick into the room. He slid into a seat at the table, reaching out for a glass and the jug of water Alfred had set out. Dick slid into the seat next to Duke. Can everyone cease bickering and focus? Damien cut in, irritated, still holding the package at arm's length. We have yet to determine who this belongs to. Duke glanced over, pouring the water. What's that? A bomb? Jason said again. Duke blinked and still pouring water. At 8 a.m.? Bombs don't have time limits, Glowstick. They quite literally do. I thought you would be immediately familiar with that, actually. Dick choked on his own spit, dropping the apple he'd grabbed from the fruit bowl. Jason opened and closed his mouth for a few seconds, as if unable to formulate a response. Holy shit, Duke, let him get up, Steph spoke from the doorway, awe in her voice. She was dressed in pajamas, her wavy hair big and fluffy from how she'd slept. She had a little leftover makeup on her face from the night before, glittery eyeshadow smudged beneath her eyes, along with leftover gray-black mascara. She looked a little bit like a sparkly panda. Oh, hey, Steph, Duke grinned at her. Hey. She wandered in the room, beelining to the cupboard where Cass stored all her snacks. You still coming with me later? Duke's grin faltered a little. Later? To the arcade, Steph responded, head now inside the cupboard. Thought that was tomorrow. No, tomorrow's movie night. Duke winced. Movie night? Steph leaned backwards and leveled him an unimpressed stare, a box of crackers in one hand. You forgot about movie night, too? Okay, people, let's focus, Dick immediately interrupted, having recovered from his shock. Dick breathed out a sigh of relief at the change of subject. Dick picked up his apple and began throwing it up in the air repeatedly. The package isn't a bomb. Then he paused, eyeing it. Probably. Alfred, is it a bomb? Of course not, Master Richard, Alfred sniffed primly. Perish the thought. All parcels are screened for explosive before being brought inside. Duke finally seemed to notice water creeping over the rim of the glass. He hurriedly righted the jug, spilling several drops across the table in the process. Alfred silently placed a cloth beside him. Thanks, Duke murmured. Alfred inclined his head slightly, then stepped away. Who's it addressed to? Dick asked, leaning across the table for a better look, the apple he'd been throwing up now safely in his hand. No one, Damien said, holding it out towards him. It bears only the manor's address. Maybe it's for Bruce, Jason suggested. He dropped heavily into a seat opposite of Duke, who paused halfway through a bite of toast to glance at him. Father's name would be included. Maybe it's for all of us, Duke suggested, voice muffled through his food. Then it would presumably say so, Damien replied. Maybe it's a surprise, Steph offered, hopping onto the kitchen counter by the sink and crossing her legs. She opened the box of crackers. Mystery box. Fun. Alfred leveled her with an unimpressed stare as she pretended not to see. Damien considered her for a moment, then shook his head. If it were intended to be a surprise, labeling it with the contents would rather defeat the purpose. It isn't labeled with its contents, Dick pointed out. He put his apple down and reached over for the box. Damien reluctantly relinquished it to him. Dick gently turned it over. It just says here to keep it out of direct sunlight. Jason paused halfway through stealing a piece of toast from the rack. Huh? Dick rotated the box so the warning sticker faced him. Jason leaned forward, squinting at it. Why is the sun so angry? It is not angry, Damien said. It is frowning. Yeah, angrily. Duke swallowed his toast and leaned across the table at those. Are those fangs? Dick tilted the box slightly. Huh. Jason's eyebrows rose. Maybe it is for all of us. Someone mailed us a vampire. The box is way too small for that, Jay, Dick snorted. He shook his head a little. What if someone sent us a miniature vampire? Duke pulled a concerning face. That'd be sick. The box lacks air holes, Damien said. Vampires don't need air, Steph cuts in. Fist deep in the box of crackers now. Jason raised a brow. Do you actually know that? Steph shrugged, dropping a cracker into her mouth. Yeah, actually, I feel pretty confident about it. The kitchen door opened again. Tim wandered in, his attention fixed on his phone, his hair sticking up at the back as he was probably wearing a crinkled shirt beneath a huge Superboy hoodie that fell about mid-thigh, unzipped. He made several steps into the room before glancing up at the unusual concentration of people around the breakfast table. He stood around, briefly flicking to Steph on the counter before settling back on the table. "What are you all doing?" "Attempting to identify the recipient of this package," Damien said. Dick held it up. "Any ideas?" Tim squinted at it. "Oh yeah, that's probably mine." "Oh," Dick deflated. Dick slumped back into his chair. "Ugh, boring." Jason wrinkled his nose, clearly agreeing. That was a disappointingly easy to solve. Tim walked over to the fridge and opened it, reaching into it. He emerged a second later with a carton of coconut water. His eyes snapped back to the box as Dick gave it another experimental shake. "Do not do that." Dick immediately froze. "Why?" "The bottles might break." There was a brief silence. Jason slowly lowered the piece of toast from his hand. "What bottles?" Tim crossed over the room and held out his hand. "Give it." Dick drew the package protectively against his chest, like it was his child. "You said it was only probably yours." "Yeah, but it has Bart's handwriting on it," Tim said. Now shook his outstretched hand expectantly. "Now gimme." The four boys at the table looked at the handwritten address, drawing closer together so that they could all see it. Tim watched them with a slightly raised eyebrow. Damon's eyes narrowed. He looked up at Tim, who was standing at the end of the table. "You can identify Alan's handwriting from 6 feet away?" Tim shrugged, unscrewing the carton lid. "He writes his A's backwards. Pass a glass, will you?" Duke nudged a glass in his direction. "Thanks." Dick examined the label. The second A in Wayne Manor was indeed backwards. "And Con drew the warning sticker," Tim added, now pouring coconut water into the glass. Duke leaned towards Dick, tilting his head and examining the box again. "How can you tell?" "The sun has an S curl." Dick turned the box over. The frowning sun did, inexplicitly, have a tiny curl hanging over its forehead. Jason squinted at it. "That's supposed to be Superman hair?" "Superboy hair," Tim corrected. "Looks like a worm," Steph mumbled through a mouthful of food, squinting at it from across the room. Then she winced, one hand holding her head. "Ow, anyone got painkillers?" Her question went unanswered as Tim shrugged, sipping from his glass. "Con can't draw." Dick finally surrendered the package. Tim tucked it beneath one arm and resumed looking at his phone. Alfred approached Steph and placed 2 pills and a fresh glass of water beside her. She looked up at gratitude. "You're my favorite." "So you frequently assure me when hungover, Miss Stephanie." "I mean it every time." "I'm certain." Alfred set another plate of toast in the center of the table, then slipped through an adjoining door, disappearing into the hallway. For a moment, everything was quiet, a truly rare phenomenon in the Wayne household, most likely induced by the early hour of the day and the unusual number of sleepy Waynes already awake. Duke pulled a bowl towards himself and poured in a heap of cereal. Dick picked up his apple again and began cutting it into neat slices on his plate. Jason and Damien got into a staring contest over the same slice of toast, despite there being a multitude of other slices to choose from. Jason won, grinning smugly as he put it on his plate. Steph continued to crunch on her crackers, watching her spot from the counter. "What did they send you?" Duke asked, eventually, pushing his spoon around his bowl. Tim shrugged. "No idea." Damien squinted. "But you said there were bottles inside." "Mm-hmm. I can hear them," Tim mumbled, absently frowning at whatever was on his phone. "Glass ones." Jason glanced at Dick. Dick glanced right back at him. Jason asked, "Why were they sending you anything at all?" Tim put the package down on the edge of the table and slid into the chair there, leaning his chin on one hand. He was still looking at something on his phone, barely paying attention to them. "Birthday present, probably." The room went dead silent, besides Steph's crunching. Tim finally looked away from the device in his hand. "What?" "Tim, it's your birthday?" Dick asked, face horrified. "No." The room breathed a collective sigh of relief. "It was my birthday yesterday." Bruce walked into the room, dressed in a suit and looking like he was still mostly asleep. He immediately walked over to the coffee machine and started on his morning coffee, as if he was unaware of anyone else in the room. Then he paused, head slowly turning towards them, took in the collective horror on everyone else's faces. "What happened?" "It's Tim's birthday!" Dick announced accusingly. "Yesterday," Tim corrected. "It was my birthday yesterday." Tim's eyes widened a little. He glanced at the calendar mounted on the fridge. "July 20th. It was your birthday yesterday. Tim sighed like they were hugely inconveniencing him. It's not a big deal. Of course it's a big deal, Dick exclaimed. Why didn't you tell us? Did I need to? Tim looked genuinely confused. You know when my birthday is. Look, it's on the calendar. They all looked at it, like Bruce had a moment before. Indeed, there in big letters were the words, Tim's birthday, in Alfred's neat handwriting. I know it was his birthday, Steph said, raising a hand. We went out last night to celebrate. We? Dick questioned weakly. Me, Steph, and Cass, Tim supplied after a moment. Gone to. Killer hangover, by the way, Steph muttered. Thanks for that, Tim. You're never hungover. It's so annoying. Tim grinned at her, sickly sweet. You're welcome. Oh, Stephanie, darling? She stuck her tongue out at her, and he looked around the room. No Cass? Still sleeping, Steph said. Hungover. Don't poke the bear. Tim shuddered dramatically and went a little tense when he realized the rest of the room was still quietly watching him. What? There was a long moment of silence. Then Jason leaned into his chair. Well, happy birthday, I guess? Thanks, Tim said dryly, picking at the tape on his package. Dick pushed out his chair and crossed the room, wrapped both arms around Tim before he could retreat. Yep, Tim muttered into his chest as Dick squished him. This is great. He let it continue for a moment before he awkwardly tapped at Dick's arm. Release me? How old are you now? Dick asked into his hair instead of letting him go. There's so many of you now, I can never keep track. 17. Dick snorted, pulling back a bit. Tim didn't laugh, just frowned. Dick's laughter slowly died, and then he pulled back more, letting go of it. No, seriously, Tim, how old are you? 17, Tim said again, completely serious. Weren't you 17 last year? Mm-hmm. You were also 17 the year before that. Was I? Tim glanced at him. Yes. Oh. Then Tim considered it. Well, yeah, I guess. Damien muttered suspiciously with a deep furrow in his brow. You were also 17 when you met me, Drake. Jason's frown deepened, sat up a little straighter. Hold on, Tim, Dick asked apprehensively. How long have you been 17? Amused flicker passes over Tim's face. A while. Duke immediately slammed a hand down on the table and pointed at him with his other hand. Twilight! That was a Twilight reference! Tim's face split open in a grin. Yes! Duke slapped the table again. Delighted. I knew it! Dick glanced between them, face confused. Was what a Twilight reference? How long have you been 17? Duke repeated, gestured empathetically at Tim. A while. Edward says it when Bella finds out he's a vampire. Bruce's eyes narrowed, glancing between Tim and the coffee repeatedly. Despite looking mostly asleep still, it looks like his brain was going 100 miles an hour. Ugh, Steph groaned. Seriously, Tim, you can do better than a Twilight reference. Nah, I think Twilight is great. Tim waved her off, still grinning. Although I don't sparkle. You don't sparkle? What? Duke's eyes has gone wide, staring at Tim. No way. What? Jason asked, turning to him. No way, Duke said again. What? Jason snapped, irritated now. I do not understand. Damien was studying Tim with an intense frown. How could you be 17 this year, be 17 last year, and 17 the year before that? Oh, Tim said with a casual shrug. I'm a vampire. The room went completely silent, besides the noise of Duke slapping a hand over his mouth. Steph crunched another cracker, deafening in the quiet room. Bruce's eyes flicked towards her. She stopped chewing as soon as he noticed. What? You don't seem surprised, Bruce said. Oh, Steph swallowed. Yeah, I knew. Dick turned towards her, mouth dropping open. You knew? Duh, we dated. Jason stared at her. And that never came up? Between us? Steph asked. Her lips curved into a smirk. Oh, frequently. Duke gagged loudly in his hand. Stop, we don't want to know. With us, Steph, Dick exclaimed. Why did you never come up with us? Steph blinked. I thought you knew. Why would you think that? Because he's very obviously a vampire? Steph looked around them unimpressed. Greatest detectives alive, by the way. Before Dick could respond, the kitchen door creaked open again, and Cass shuffled into the room. She was still wearing the clothes from the night before. Her hair was flattened against one side of her head. Her eyes were narrowed to slit against the morning light. Everyone fell silent as she crossed the room. Cass ignored them, and she trudged straight towards Tim, dropping heavily onto the floor beside his chair and resting her head on his thigh with a quiet sigh, closing her eyes. Tim looked down at her. Morning. Cass let out a low, miserable groan and wrapped both her arms around his leg. Shh. Head hurt? She nodded against his leg. Tim patted her hair sympathetically. Steph said not to bother you. Too loud, Cass mumbled. Never going out with you again. Tim let out a small snort. Cass slowly lifted her head and squinted around the room. Everyone was staring at Tim. Why weird? Dick pointed at Tim. Because Tim just casually revealed he's a vampire. Cass stared at him. Then she lowered her head back onto Tim's leg with a tired sigh, closing her eyes again. Yes. Dick's pointed hand dropped, his face going slack at the realization this wasn't news to her. Jason looked between them. You knew too? Cass cracked one eye open, obviously. Dick gasped at her. Why does everyone keep saying that? And you never thought to mention that he was a vampire? Jason demanded. Cass winced at the volume and pressed her face harder against Tim's thigh. Tim put a hand over her head again, petting her hair gently. I thought you knew, she mumbled. Obvious. It is not obvious, Jason snapped, throwing his hands up. Tim raised a brow. Yeah it is. I'm pale, I'm nocturnal, I don't sleep. You never slept before? Dick cut in. And we're all nocturnal. I'm not, Dick cut in, now spooning cereal into his mouth. I have a normal sleep schedule. Tim continued. I've been 17 for years. I can peer through walls. I avoid direct sunlight. You're a vigilante. We all avoid direct sunlight. I drink blood. Jason threw his hands wider and waved them around. You drink everything out of an opaque travel mug. We thought it was coffee. Tim gestured towards his own face. Also, fangs. You don't walk around with your fangs out, Dick protested. Tim tilted his head. Huh, good point. Then he frowned, looking at each of them in turn. Did you guys really not know I was a vampire? I don't exactly hide it. No! Dick squeaked, putting his head in his hands. God, I thought you were just weird! Tim stared at him, face mildly offended. Why would you think that? Because Tim being weird is much more likely explanation than Tim is secretly a vampire. I wasn't secretly a vampire, Tim corrected him. I'm a vampire. You just guys thought it was a secret. You never told us, Dick deflated. Tim shrugged. You never asked. Jason's eyes twitched. People don't generally ask their brothers if they're vampires, Tim. Maybe you should start. Duke immediately turned to Damien, eyeing him suspiciously. What? Damien snapped, staring back at him. Nothing, Duke said, squinting at him. Show me your teeth real quick. I am not a vampire, Thomas, Damien snapped. Whoa, chill, Duke said, clearly amused. Just checking. The second most likely candidate is out. If anyone else in this family is going to be a vampire, it's probably going to be you or Bruce. He turned towards Bruce, who just sipped on his coffee and stared back at him deadpan. After a long moment, Duke pulled a face. To be decided. He briefly considered Dick, then dismissed it with a shake of his head. Dick frowned. Why am I not a candidate? Duke wrinkled his nose, looked at him up and down. You'd somehow end up running a group of vampires or something, he said, shaking his head again. I'm getting bad vibes. Dick stared at him, bemused. Tim returned his glance to his phone as Duke returned to his cereal. Jason's eyes suddenly focused on Tim's glass as Tim raised it to take another sip. Wait, you're drinking coconut water. Tim paused it halfway to his mouth. Yeah? But you're a vampire. You drink blood. Yes, sometimes, said with a shrug. Sometimes I drink coconut water. Alfred keeps the stocks for me. Alfred knows too? Dick asked, quietly, still slouched with an air of despair. His hands were over his face. Of course, Tim frowned. He's Alfred. I thought vampires only drank blood, Jason interrupted, still frowning at Tim. We need blood, Tim corrected, sipping at his glass of coconut water. But it doesn't mean it's the only liquid we can consume. But why coconut water? It has a similar electrolyte balance to blood plasma. It's close enough that our body can actually get something useful from it anyway. Tim lowered his glass slightly. It doesn't replace feeding, but it keeps me hydrated and takes the edge off. Plus, it tastes good. Jason stared at him. So what? It's vampire Gatorade? Tim paused and looked down at his glass, considering. Huh. Basically. Bruce lowered his coffee and approached the table. What happens if you're exposed to sunlight? Tim glanced at him. Nothing too dramatic, just a little bit of a bad sunburn. Makes me tired, gives me a headache if I'm out for too long. Tim shrugged, but it's fine. Steph narrowed her eyes at him. A bit of a bad sunburn, he says, as if he didn't almost disintegrate in my arms. Tim rolled his eyes. One time. That was one time, Steph. One time too many, Steph muttered, glaring at him. Cass seemed to have fallen asleep, leaning against Tim's leg. Mouth slightly open and her eyes closed. Tim's hand was still gently moving through her hair. Ruth frowned, looking at Tim. You frequently go out during daylight hours. Tim waved him off dismissively. Frequently? Nah, more like rarely. Besides, when was the last time you saw the sun in Gotham, Bruce? Duke paused, a spoon halfway to his mouth. Jason glanced at the window, where a thick layer of gray clouds pressed against the glass. Huh, he said. Kid's got a point. I'm fine, Tim assured Bruce. It's basically the same for Edward Cullen moved to Forks. Stiff groaned loudly. Again? What? It's relevant, Tim said. You can't keep referencing Twilight. It's getting old, she complained. You need new material. Tim smirked at her. Maybe, but Twilight just speaks to me. It accurately describes my situation. It really doesn't. Me and Edward are besties, Tim continued. Steph grimaced and stuck her tongue out at her, covered in bits of cracker. Bruce ignored their little spat. And if Gotham does have a sunny day? Tim considered that for a moment. Then I wear sunscreen. Bruce stared at him. SPF 100, Tim added helpfully. Jason snorted. I can't believe we never knew Tim as a vampire, Dick sighed, rubbing one hand over his face. How do we not know? Tim shrugged. Skill issue. Dick looked at like Tim had just slapped him. Before he could respond, Duke suddenly asked, Hey, if I lit up like a glow stick right now, would you disintegrate? The room went silent. Tim blinked at Duke. Damien said, Please do not attempt to vaporize Drake in the breakfast table, Thomas. I do not want Drake dust in my food. Tim narrowed his eyes at him. I would taste delicious. Duke let a noise of disgust. What is wrong with you all? Tim turned back to Duke. We should try that out sometime. When are you free? Duke lit up. Not literally, but close to it. I have time. No, Bruce cut in. Please do not try that particular science experiment. Duke deflated, disappointed. Jason tapped the package sitting beside Tim's elbow, attempting to divert the conversation. So, are you ever going to open that, or are we just going to continue ignoring the mysterious bottles your friend mailed to you? Oh, right! Tim's eyes dropped to it, having completely forgotten about it. He moved his hand away from Cass's hair just long enough to pull the box closer. Cass made a quiet, displeased noise, so he immediately resumed petting her with one hand while tearing through the tape with another. Inside were 4 dark bottles, each tightly wrapped between layers of black tissue paper. Each one had been sealed with a metal cap and decorated in a differently, brightly colored bow. A card lay on top. Duke reached for it. Tim slapped his hand away. Hey, it's my card. That makes me want to read it more. Tim grabbed it before Duke could take another attempt at reaching for it and unfolded it beneath the table. Jason leaned forward. What's it say? Nothing, Tim said immediately, the card still beneath the table. Just happy birthday. Then why are you hiding it? Duke asked. I'm not. You're literally holding it under the table. Dick reached over Tim's shoulder and snatched it from his hand. Dick jumped out of reach and held the card above his head, clearing his throat dramatically. Happy birthday. Happy 17th birthday again, you ancient undead freak. Ancient? Jason repeated. Damon's eyes narrowed. Precisely how many 17th birthdays have you celebrated? Tim reached for the card. Give that back! Dick held it higher, pushing him away with one hand. Love from Con, Bart, and Cassie. P.S. The O negative is from Bart, so you might not want to drink it before patrol unless you want to hear colors. Duke stared at the bottles with renewed fascination. They send you blood? They know what I like. They sent it through the mail? It's refrigerated packaging. Bruce closed his eyes briefly. We will be discussing this later. Do we have to? Tim sighed, sounding tired. This is just new to you guys, but not to me. Yes. Back into his chair. Dick finally returned the card, though his expression remained slightly suspicious. You still haven't answered Damien's question. I don't remember what it was, Tim sighed. You guys are interrogating me too much. How many times have you turned 17? Dick prompted him. Tim tucked the card back into the box. A few. That isn't an answer, Damien said. And you're not getting one, Tim told them firmly. Fair enough, Dick said, but we're putting 17 candles on your birthday cake tonight. Tim scrunched up his face. We aren't having cake tonight. We missed your birthday. I already celebrated it. Not with us, Jason said, not really listening that much anymore as he helped himself to more breakfast. Hey, glow stick, pass the butter. Duke shoved the butter dish across the table. Steph put down her box of crackers. To be fair, he doesn't eat cake. Dick hesitated, shoulders dropping slightly. Oh, we can put candles in a plug bag, Duke suggested. Tim looked at the package, then around to everyone gathered. 17 candles? He asked reluctantly. Dick brightened. 17 candles. Tim sighed. Fine, but no singing. Notes. Not pictured. Con passed out in Tim's room, snoring soundly and practically dead to the world. Wrote this in a day because I really wanted to get something out for Tim's birthday after realizing it was yesterday, the 19th, despite not having a fun time at the ATM and all the bullshit suddenly going on in my life over the last few days. So I hope you enjoyed. Updates on my other fics will probably be on pause for a while while I deal with the stuff. If you're reading any of those, but I will be back as soon as possible. Did you catch the DC versus Vampires reference? Okay, that's all for 17 going on 17. I love this. This was such a fun read, and I'm so happy I got to podfic it because it was so funny. Oh my goodness, I really, really do like it. The link to the fic will be in the description. So, yeah, that's it. Have a good night, day, whatever time, all that jazz. See ya.